conspiracy. They each had a role to play. They also planned, as you heard, for the eventuality, the prospective potential eventuality that if they were both arrested, what they would do in that circumstance as well, as you heard from Detective Gable. And we heard that some of that evidence came through the testimony of Christopher Austin. Baker told Austin that if he was ever arrested, that he should not mention the defendant. And we heard that the defendant and Baker planned that if they were arrested, the only thing they would admit to would be the affair. And we heard the defendant make a specific statement in writing in her jail letter, and that is contained within Exhibit 226. There were a couple of envelopes of jail mail that were recovered, as you recall, from their cells after the arrest. This was a letter that I believe is dated June 28th. So we're talking about a letter that she drafts within a couple of weeks of the arrest. And she talks about specifically in that same exact language that she only is going to admit, or she only has admitted to an affair of about a year. And you recall they both stick to that plan. So again, it sort of begs the question, because if you are saying, we also hear them make verbal comments about this, and she actually reduces her to writing, if you are saying, I only admitted to an affair of about a year, what is the other thing that you're not admitting to? What is the other thing that you are concealing? When you say, I only admitted to an affair, what is the other thing you're trying to hide? And that is their conspiracy to kill Fabio. And so we also heard the defendant and Robert Baker talk about in these lockup overhears, both in Van Nuys as well as here behind Department 101 in the lockup back there. And you saw some video of what that looks like, that neither of them would testify against the other, neither of them would take any deals, neither of them would give up the other. And we heard Robert Baker saying that he was going to take it to his grave. What is it that he's taking to the grave? It's not the affair, because they admit to the affair. Again, begs the question. So they both agreed prior to this, that was part of the conspiracy, because again, a conspiracy is ongoing until you accomplish. It can be ongoing until you accomplish the object of the conspiracy. The object of the conspiracy, again, is dual, just as I talked about with respect to dual motives yesterday. To kill Fabio, but also to be able to obtain the life insurance money. So this is a conspiracy that's ongoing because they've yet been able to do so. And so they make a pact. They make a pact to maintain their silence because, again, if either of them talked or testified, both of them would go down. And that's why we hear in the lockup those recordings. If you didn't understand what they were talking about, hopefully it's become more and more clear, and you're probably going to need to go back and review some of those recordings and transcripts. But there are statements about the fact that they're not going to say anything, that they're going to maintain their silence, that they're sticking to protocol, or the one the defense played for you on their last day of their case, which was now 2 days ago, where he said, stick to the program, and she says she is. As Detective Gable, again, explained when I mentioned it yesterday, this was their protocol. Protocol is a plan, then they put it into action, and then it becomes the policy. It becomes the program. And you heard me talk about protocols with all the different lab personnel, from the LAPD's crime lab, Randy Zepeda, from Leslie Thompson, from the sheriff's lab, who did the testing on the toothpaste tube that Baker was passing to the defendant containing his semen. There are standards, protocols, policies, practices that are put into play that they follow in order, again, to ensure that the outcome can be verified. And in this case, that's what they're doing. They've put their own program or policy into place because he's a military guy, believe it or not. So again, you need to ask yourselves the question, would Baker really have killed Fabio without the defendant's knowledge, participation, and agreement, without her intent that the murder take place, without her intent to kill, without her intent to agree to this conspiracy? Would he have done that on his own? Because wouldn't that run the very obvious risk that that would backfire and that she would no longer be able to live here in the United States, that she would have to go back to Canada? That would ruin his whole plan of having her a member to himself, right? And that would be the reasonable likelihood because she has no means of support here. So again, when he very cavalierly said, when I asked him about this on the stand, well, that was the chance I was willing to take. You really think so? You really think so? If you're willing to murder somebody, don't you want to know that the reason you're doing it is going to be something you can count on? That doesn't pass the common sense test, the smell test, so to speak. So one of the things that you're going to also hear about with respect to the law, and I'm going to talk about in some detail, that the conspirators are sometimes referred to as co-conspirators. Under the law, they don't have to know each other. And remember, we talked about this, I believe, during jury selection. You're going to hear about it again as I go through the law today, and you're going to hear about it again next week from the Honorable Judge Cohen when he reads you the law, that co-conspirators don't have to know each other because you can, in your head, probably come up with plenty of circumstances. If you talked about, let's say, organized crime, right? Not everybody in the conspiracy knows one another. When you think of conspiracy, think of it, you can think of it like a big wheel, right? You have somebody at the center, or maybe a couple of people at the center who are calling the shots. We'll call them the shot callers. And then you have spokes that go out to other individuals who are going to do different things, such as maybe one guy is going to go out and he's going to threaten people. We talked about, let's say, like organized crime, into paying what they refer to as taxes, right, to support the conspiracy. You can conduct your business here, but you're going to have to pay us in order to leave you alone, right? So you can see how not everybody needs to know each other. As I said, the law is pretty brilliant in this country, because it contemplates various scenarios that criminals would use in order to get off, right? Well, I didn't know these other individuals. Who cares, right? You have to have the elements. Was there an agreement? Was there an agreement between two or more of the co-conspirators? Did you have the specific intent to agree to commit the crime, in this case murder? Did you have the intent, the specific intent to commit the crime? In this case it's murder, so as we talked about, the mental state for murder, express malice of forethought, meaning intent to kill, as I discussed at length yesterday, and the evidence that supports that. And was there an overt act? Doesn't mean, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, that you accomplish the object of the conspiracy. But if there's an overt act, an act towards the accomplishment of the conspiracy, you're guilty of conspiracy. You can be guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, even if the murder doesn't happen. And I'm sure all of you have seen crime shows where that goes down, where they uncover a conspiracy to kill somebody, but the person doesn't get killed, right? Because once you meet the elements, the conspiracy is complete. Okay? So that's why you can be guilty of the crime of murder, but you can also be guilty of a conspiracy to commit that crime. You can be guilty of one without the other. Okay. So let's talk about what this means, these elements. So the law says that the formation and the existence of a conspiracy can be inferred from all of the circumstances tending to show a common intent. And that makes sense, right? Because it is unlikely in a criminal conspiracy that people are going to reduce their agreement to a writing, like a contract, right? So you have to infer that there was an agreement based on the fact that you have individuals who are showing their intent to act together. And when they come together and act together as a team to bring about the object of the conspiracy, to bring about a crime or a criminal result, that's what the law contemplates. So we don't have to have caught somebody on tape agreeing with somebody else to commit a crime. It can be, again, inferred from the circumstances, okay, tending to show this common intent. Now, as I talked about yesterday, that there are different types of proof or evidence under the law. There's direct evidence where someone sees, like an eyewitness, or you have Christopher Austin or Robert Baker who were involved in these crimes, who tell you. And we know from the testimony of Christopher Austin, there was an agreement between he and Baker, right, to commit this crime. That's why he flew out. That's why Baker sent him the money to come to LA to kill Fabio. We also know that, again, Baker, and I don't want to rely on him for anything, but we have to look at where he is corroborated independently, as I talked about yesterday, because otherwise you can't put any credibility in anything he says. But we have to look at the fact that he himself admitted that he engaged in a conspiracy. In fact, as you heard, he pled guilty to this crime. Well, to plead guilty to the crime of conspiracy to commit murder, he had to have agreed with somebody else, at least one other person, as we talked about just a moment ago. It's the first element. There has to be an agreement between two or more, okay? So Baker tells us he went to Las Vegas. He made plans. He bought a knife. He sent money to Austin. This is back in July of 2016 to bring Austin out. And he's going to bring this, I think he said it was like a 12-inch blade, like some huge knife. Because he wanted to see what Austin would say about the knife. And so he has Austin come out, and they drive, he picks him up at LAX, and they drive out to Las Vegas, where they stay, remember, at Al Birdsong's house in July of 2016. And I'm going to get back to how this all fits into the conspiracy. And while he's there, they discuss this conspiracy to kill Fabio. And so we already know from both Austin and Baker that there's a conspiracy that's been agreed to. So you can have it proved by direct evidence. That would be direct evidence, but you can also have it proved by circumstantial evidence. And as I told you in this case, you have both. You have direct evidence straight out of witnesses' mouths who told you what happened, what they spoke about, what they observed, what was discussed, what they heard, and what they saw. But you also have circumstantial evidence, meaning that you can infer evidence, you can infer facts from the circumstances of the case. And from the circumstances of the case, we know that there was also an agreement between the defendant and Robert Baker. What's the law say? It says that all of the co-conspirators do not have to get together and have a meeting. In other words, it doesn't matter. When they were saying, well, you never spoke to Monica. They were asking Mr. Austin about this plan to kill her husband, right? No. You know, when you think about Austin, one of the things that I remembered thinking, other than his demeanor on the stand, which for someone who had never been in trial, who been charged with a crime, who, because of what his association was with Robert Baker and because of what he agreed to do in this case, his future is forever changed, right? We don't know when he's ever going to get out, right? He doesn't know that. Because he entered into a plea agreement where he has what's called an indeterminate sentence, right? 15 to life plus 1 year for the use of the knife. So when you think about his demeanor on the stand, given what has happened to him over the course of the last few months, it was striking to me, and again, I told you that the judge is going to read you instructions that give you various factors that you can take into account in judging the credibility of witnesses, such as bias, interest, motive to lie, of course. The things that, again, are based on common sense, but you can also look at things like a witness's demeanor on the stand, their attitude toward giving testimony, whether they've ever been convicted of a felony, whether they've ever admitted to lying like Baker, whether they've ever admitted to perjury, things of that nature that you know should be something you would be able to take into account, right? Those things weigh heavily on who you put your faith behind, right? So also things like, were they in a position to perceive what they said that they saw? Were they consistent or inconsistent? Were they able to recall sufficient details that tends to indicate the reliability or confirm the reliability of what they said? Is there independent evidence of what they said, right? All those kinds of things, plus more. Anything based on your common sense. You're the judges of the facts. Judge Cohen makes the decisions on the law, but you are here to judge the facts. And you have taken this so seriously over the last few months, right? This is your job. We're deadly serious, right? Because someone lost their life here. But when Austin got on the stand, even under cross-examination, he behaved better than their experts, who threw little temper tantrums on the stand. Or Baker, who said, I'm out of here, I'm done answering this silly question. No, sit down. Right? Shocking. He's not a professional. These other individuals, the divorce lawyer, the guy who's managing the estate assets, who came up with 1,000,001 reasons on why he almost missed the date to exercise the options, which means P&G had to send him letters saying, hey, buddy.
Objection, Your Honor, that was not the divorce. Overruled.
You're getting ready. I'm not talking about the divorce lawyer. I think I was clear. I'm talking about the guy that's managing the estate, Mr. Rubin, that came back and said, oh, he's now going to build the estate maybe if he can. He's going to figure that out so he can take some more money. Because he was so great on the stand that he should be able to build the estate for his time. Who seemed offended by the fact that he had to answer questions on cross-examination. Right? Who talked over Miss Stagel. And we saw that actually happen with both men. I'm not going to call them gentlemen, because they certainly treated the prosecutor, who just happens to be female, differently than they treated the male who asked them questions, right? Their demeanor drastically changed. Maybe I'm imagining it. Mr. Austin? He didn't do that. I'm not saying I would invite Mr. Austin over for dinner in my home. But demeanor, their attitude toward giving testimony. Mr. Baker, he treated this with such contempt. He treated you with contempt. He lied to you from moment to moment to moment, and then doubled down on it, even when it made no sense. And I'll get to that. He thinks you're stupid. I'm betting on you. Common sense. So again, the co-conspirators don't all have to meet. No express or formal agreement is necessary. You're going to hear this in the law Judge Cohen is going to read to you. As I mentioned, yesterday, as well as when Ms. Spagel and I spoke to you during jury selection, I'm going to stop. It's not because I get distracted, because I can talk over anything, but I don't want you to be distracted, because I'm talking about the law. We welcome the burden of proof. We don't shy away from it. We know we had the goods when we walked into this courtroom. That's why you're here. We've been waiting 8 years for you people. But under the law, there are certain things we don't have to prove. And you're going to hear this as well in the instructions. We do not have to prove, as I said, that the co-conspirators met or know each other. And again, going back to Austin, he could have lied, right? He could have said, hey, I was just the lookout. We wouldn't know any different. How would we prove different? Baker's saying he was only the lookout, because Baker doesn't want to have him out there on the patio with him, because it calls into question Baker's credibility about the gold coins and everything else that went down, right? So he has to paint Austin as a liar, because he sees it as a choice. You believe me? She gets out. She gets the money. She can support me from the outside. You heard them talk about that. Baby, you got to go home if you can go home. You've got support out there. And what does she tell him? Wait for me. As long as it takes. Wait for me. They're in this for the long haul. You're pawns in a game for them. Austin could have lied. He would have maybe gone to a different sentence, different plea agreement. He also could have embellished. He could have said, I absolutely talked to her. She told me she wanted her husband dead. And then you sat, that was a huge mistake, you sat and listened for a day and a half. And you all know I'll use the word meticulous because it sounds better, to a fault, right? And I questioned him till I was done, like them, till I have every answer I want, right? Because this isn't a game to me, or them, or her. I questioned him for a day and a half. Miss Stagel questioned him. Miss Stagel flew up to Vancouver, Washington, to be there, to have eyes on what happened when they took Austin down at the end of last year, to make sure everything was done by the book, to be there to support if there was any legal questions that came up. He could have said, oh yeah, I talked to her, right? Because if they're claiming he's making stuff up to get a deal, and they made this big deal out of the fact that, oh, the evidence has to have value, so he's going to add to his story. Well, if that's true, why didn't he do that? Why didn't he say, oh yeah, I talked to her. This is what she told me. Wouldn't that make his story more valuable? Maybe be willing to give him more? He didn't do that. He didn't minimize, but he didn't embellish either. So again, you're looking at details, right, that support credibility when you're making these decisions. He could have said, you know what, I do remember in Vegas. And we kept going back over that point with him because I knew that I had records that indicated that he and Baker were in Vegas at the same time as the defendant was. when again she's sneaking around behind Fabio's back while he's working this event there that he's emceeing, that he's in charge of, right? Where thousands of people are going to these events. She's sneaking around and meeting up with Baker. Well, I'll talk about that. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, you know what, I totally do remember meeting with her, and this is what she told us. He doesn't say that. He says, I know we went to Vegas, and then we have to show him documents. Like, do you remember this at the Aria? Oh, yeah, we were at the Aria. But I don't remember. I might have met her. He introduced me to a lot of people, but I don't remember. So he doesn't embellish, okay? We also have to prove that the defendant personally committed an overt act. In this case, she did. She's the one that sets Fabio up and makes the calls to her daughters to make sure one leaves. She accesses the app to make sure her daughter's gone, right? Jessica, who planned the Friday before that she's going to babysit over at Deborah Obad, so they knew they had this window. Because remember, they have to make this plan B on the fly because January 22nd went sideways because Austin got cold feet, right? So January 23rd, not only does the defendant commit another overt act, and I'm going to talk about the safe too, she also calls Bella. Remember Bella getting on the stand? And Bella says, oh, I was getting ready to go home after my interview at the deli in Agora after school until my mom called and said I had to go pick up my glasses. But because I was only 16, my mom had to get special permission from the eye doctor, Dr. Cohen, so I would be able to pick those glasses up, right? Because she wants her out of the way for a sufficient period of time so that Baker can get up to the house and complete what needs to be done, right? So there's many overt acts by the defendant. But we don't have to even prove she committed an overt act. As long as we prove she was a part of, that there's an agreement between two or more, that she specifically intended to agree, that she specifically intended to have the crime committed, you see those two things are different. You have to specifically intend to agree. You also have to specifically intend to have the crime committed. You have to act with intent to kill. And that there's an overt act. Doesn't have to be by her. And again, we talked about this yesterday when we discussed a theory of first-degree murder. You all don't have to even be unanimous as to which overt act was proven in this case. There are 56 of them. I don't know if you remember, but way back at the beginning of the trial, before we started, the judge read you the indictment from the grand jury, indicting the defendant and Robert Baker. And within that indictment, and this is a document where the defendant and Baker were indicted back in, I believe it was August of 2017, we listed overt acts based on the evidence we knew at that time. Now, one of the reasons to bring somebody like Christopher Austin in is because he's able to clarify for us some of the inside details we would not otherwise know. So some of those overt acts might not apply because he provided other information that now we decided maybe weren't proven or were disproven because of his inside information, or maybe other records were received. You heard that there was a lot of investigation, documentation, and evidence that was constantly being added to the investigative file in this case. And so you all don't have to be unanimous on which overt act as long as you all agree that there's one. And you have 56 to choose from. You might like number 1, you might like 2. It doesn't even matter. As long as you all agree that there's one, you're not going to be asked on the verdict forms which overt act you guys believe was proven in this case. It's just going to ask whether or not you find the defendant guilty or not guilty of the crime of conspiracy. Okay? So, as I mentioned, the words overt act, again, I like to break things down into simple forms. It helps me to understand and make sense of it in a common sense way. In this case, what is an overt act? Well, it's any step or act that's committed by one or more of the conspirators. So again, doesn't have to be the defendant. One or more of the conspirators have to take some act or some step to accomplish the object of the conspiracy. In this case, it's murder. So what the law says, and what the judge is going to read you, is that the overt act has to go beyond mere planning. In other words, the fact that they sat around in Las Vegas and talked about what was the best way to accomplish this, that's not enough. It has to go further than that. Just sitting around talking about it isn't enough. There has to be some act, right? And so then we also heard there's some more planning that goes on that we talked about yesterday between, in the month of January, a couple weeks out from when Austin flies in, between January 11th and January 13th, January 12th, there's actually the purchase of airline tickets. So maybe have we known about that? Maybe that would be an overt act. There has to be some act that goes beyond mere planning or agreement. It doesn't have to be an act that constitutes the crime. It doesn't even have to be an attempt. Now, January 22nd, had we known about that before, that's its own conspiracy to commit murder. Okay? But in this case, we're here at this point. So it's evidence that you can use to show, like I said yesterday, very unlikely that Baker and Austin get so lucky that they get Fabio alone once, let alone 2 days in a row. That comes based on information the defendant provides. Okay? So, again, the overt act doesn't have to constitute the crime of murder or even an attempt. So, let's say Baker renting the vehicle. That would be an overt act. And again, that overt act, that step taken, such as the movement of money from Baker's account so that Austin can withdraw it while he's in Alaska, that would be one. Of course, again, this is stuff that happened and we found out about after the fact. So we're stuck with the overt acts that were alleged in the information way back in August of 2017, what we knew about at that time. You'll be given the overt acts that are in the indictment, and as I've said, you can go through that, and as long as you all agree that at least one of those overt acts applies, then you're good to go. So you'll go through those as well, and from that, you'll have plenty of choices in terms of which overt act. By the way, although Austin doesn't have a clear memory of meeting the defendant at the ARIA, he knows there's evidence that suggests that they did, but he's not going to admit to something that he doesn't know. And so you heard him say, that's just not something in his proffer that I have a clear recollection of, because I've told him, hey, if I find out you lied about something, I'm not making any deals with you. Like you heard. There are certain people, the defense kept saying, well, you're a prosecution witness. The prosecution was supposed to call you. Witnesses don't belong to either side. Either side can have a subpoena issued and call whoever they choose. But we also have the choice not to call people that we believe are going to lie. For instance, Miss Obad was asked, well, you were a prosecution witness. You've talked to the prosecutor. You've talked to law enforcement. You were interviewed. You testified at the grand jury. But then it was asked, when was the last time you had any conversation or communication with the DA's office? 4 years ago. Okay. So we can choose not to call certain people that we believe are going to get on the stand and commit perjury. So Austin, who doesn't have a clear memory of meeting the defendant, now you need to go back and ask yourself, when Baker got on the stand and he went out of his way to say, oh, I left him over at this location, and then I went over here to meet Monica, he could have left Austin at Al Birdsong's. Why does he bring Austin with him to the ARIA when he's going there to meet up with the defendant? And remember, Baker also told the defense investigator, which I asked him about, the specifics. They didn't bring out all of these lies that he told over and over and over again throughout this series of ridiculous, unrecorded interviews, and some where there's a report and the notes were destroyed, and some of them we can see when we have both notes and reports that he doesn't include everything, the defense investigator, in the report. You have to go hunting through his chicken scratches to find details he chose not to include in his report. But he tells the defense investigator, I told Austin before we even went in July, hey, I might go over to meet up with Monica while we're in Las Vegas. Why do you think he brought Austin with him when he went to the Aria to meet up with the defendant? So the point is that we know, based on cell phone records, call detail records, cell tower records, and the testimony of Cy Ray, who's a geolocation expert, that these three are all together at the Aria at the same time. Fabio and the defendant are there. However, Fabio, we know the day that they go to the Aria, he's down the strip a ways at the Mandalay Bay at another event that was being hosted that week for the industry. So, again, we know that the defendant and Baker had ample opportunity to plan this crime when they were together, not just based on what's in their volume of communications, but we know that they have face-to-face communication, right? There's pillow talk. There's times when they're together alone where they had the opportunity to plan this, and there isn't going to necessarily be, let's say, a paper trail. They also, as we know, were using an encrypted app to be able to communicate secretly. And the defense brought up over and over again, well, you know, these encrypted apps, they're used by people all over the country. Absolutely, right? A little bit different back in 2017, right? We heard about that from the testimony of Curtis Davis. They weren't being used as much in this country at that time, but people who traveled internationally did, because you could talk to somebody, communicate with them for free through these encrypted applications without paying these data fees. However, keep in mind, we're not looking at what they kept doing throughout the whole trial, and they're going to do again when they get back up here. We're not looking at individual pieces of evidence in a vacuum. We're looking at the evidence in totality, which is what you heard from, again, Detective Gable, Detective Verna, and Detective Roberts. You're looking at all of the circumstances of the behavior together as a whole. When you look at items in a vacuum, they don't tell you anything. They're only significant or important or probative in terms of how they relate to other evidence in the case, right? Then it has some meaning. And when you're talking about, as you heard, criminals who are involved in planning a crime, a conspiracy, or criminal enterprise, these types of applications are often used by criminals because it allows them to hide their communication. Same reason why individuals who are involved in a criminal conspiracy use a burner phone. Again, does that mean that other people don't go and pick up a cheap phone at T-Mobile or wherever you get those from, the market? Used to be able to get them at the market? No, but you're looking at them again as a part of the evidence in its totality. And if you're using a burner phone and you're using encrypted applications and there's evidence that shows that you're participating in a criminal conspiracy to kill somebody, you're going to want to hide your communications. By using a burner phone, we can't get those types of pieces of information as we did, let's say, from the defendant's iPhone, number 119, that was seized when she was pulled over, along with her burner phone, the ZTE flip phone, if you remember. 119 is her Apple iPhone, 120 is the ZTE flip phone. Both of them are in her purse inside the Mustang at the time that she's arrested on June 14th. And I'll talk more about that burner phone a little bit later. So again, when you're talking about all of these different types of secret methods or modes of communication where you don't have to leave your name, you don't have to leave your address, you can make up addresses, which we heard Baker did on January 29th when he goes up to, I think it was Victorville, to purchase all these burner phones, 3 different burner phones. It allows you to hide your communications. So again, think about that when you're asked to look at things in a vacuum. The law specifically says that when you come to your decisions, you have to base your decisions on the evidence, and you have to look at all of the evidence in light of the other pieces of evidence and the circumstances of the crimes. So again, we know that we heard in this case evidence where the defendant is discussing with Baker in the court lockup recordings that she was afraid that law enforcement would be able to get into her phone. And remember, she makes those comments about, I'm afraid they're going to crack my phone. If they get into the phone, I'm fucked. Right? She says that one day. And another recording, she says, if they're able to get into Viber. And he goes, what? And she goes, Viber. Right? She's whispering because she doesn't want to be caught, because we also heard that they know they're being recorded, right? They say that from minute 1 in the back of the black and white police vehicle. Keep in mind the circumstances. They're not being put into the back of a black and white police vehicle with all of Robbery Homicide Division and SIS surveillance unit and taken down with a police operations van because they're having an affair? Are you kidding me? Who's going to believe that? That's not what's happening. They know they're being arrested for murder. So when the defense says, oh no, the only thing they were worried about, and the only reason they're using all of these different things like burner phones and encrypted applications and whispering is because they're covering up for an affair. Really? Come on now. So we hear her also talking about Viber. What if they find out about Viber? Because again, if the police are able to get into the phone, we did. But you're only able to recover certain things because what do? They delete Viber. How do you know they're acting together? They both deleted on January 23rd, the day of the murder. Coincidence? I mean, at what point are there too many coincidences to be able to call them coincidences? Right? Like if you have like a button, like that commercial from one of those stores where it's like, hit the button every time, that doesn't make sense. Tell me when I get to that point. When I have too many coincidences, tell me when I get to that point and you'll hit the button. Too many. We're way down that road. Because again, once they delete Viber, what happens? It deletes all of the connecting data through Viber. You might have remnants, which is how we found out they were using Viber, because when their phones were extracted, we saw that, and you heard Curtis Davis testify about that, who's the LAPD's expert on social media and encrypted apps and things of that nature. And then we go and we get the Viber records for January, and lo and behold, you've got this huge volume of communications between them. If they weren't involved in a murder, why do they need to whisper? Why do they need encrypted apps? Why do you need to use an encrypted app after Fabio's dead? You're no longer got the excuse, well, we use Viber because we're covering up the affair, because what if Fabio looks in your phone? right? And what is Baker's excuse on why Viber, why they both, he says he told her delete Viber. Why do they delete Viber on January 23rd? What's his excuse? Yep. It's glitchy. It was glitchy. Well, it worked so far. Like, why all of a sudden is it so glitchy? I don't know. It was just glitchy. It was glitchy. Right? So then I started parroting it back to him on various things. He didn't catch on. But why, after the 23rd, when they both delete Viber, why did they then, again, 3 people who just have to be involved in this conspiracy to kill, Baker, the defendant, Austin, why do they all download the same application, WhatsApp? Coincidence? I'm hitting the button. Common sense. And you might have all been wondering during jury selection, why'd they leave me on this case? Street smarts. Common sense. Doesn't matter how young you are, doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter if you wear glasses, doesn't matter the color of your skin, doesn't matter what socioeconomic group you come from. None of it matters. Common sense. It's the only thing that matters. You're experts in that, I think. So again, look at the evidence in a common sense way. Break it down. Make it simple. It's not that complicated. They made it super complicated. Why did they do that? They wanted to make it impossible. Impossible for anybody to unravel and figure out all the details. I'm no genius. I did it. So they discuss how it's going to be done. They can do it face to face. They can do it using encrypted apps. They can do it using burner phones. They also discuss when the murder is going to take place. We talked about that spike in data Detective Roberts testified to in January. And then we also heard this little piece of evidence, remember, from Austin, which was, again, there's little pieces of gold. And when they played back the proffer over 2 days, and I know, I have a very annoying, I can hear it, a very annoying nasally voice, but I could hear in the questioning where Austin gave details about things that the first time through I didn't necessarily catch. I knew it was there, but I was focused on the answer and how that related to the next question. Because when you, again, are questioning a witness, one of the most important things, which, anyway, not everybody does, is you're too focused on the next question and you forget to listen to what they're saying. And what we heard in those recordings of the proffer was that he was told by Baker that they had to get the murder done. Remember this? Before the end of January, because Fabio was going on a business trip. Lo and behold, Fabio is set to leave for Boston on January 28th. That's Exhibit 261, his travel agenda that was sent to the defendant. As Alicia testified, she always sent Fabio's agendas to the defendant so that she would know his itinerary, where he was staying, where he was going, when he was coming back, things of that nature. So obviously Baker gets that little tidbit from Monica. She tells him about that. That's why they have to get this done. Now, this is just a very simplified way, and I've obviously gone way beyond this slide off my script again. But again, we have the defendant who has to be the mastermind. Why does she have to be the mastermind besides the fact that Baker can't keep anything in his brain for more than a half a minute? Because she has the inside information. She knows what the family's schedule is, right? She's the mastermind. She wants Fabio dead so that she can collect the life insurance proceeds and so that she can live the life that she wants to live, where she feels free, as Baker said, where she's most happy. So she makes an agreement with Baker. Baker hatches the plan with her to kill Fabio, but since he's doing the dirty work and he knows Fabio is a very large, tall man, much bigger than Baker, he knows he needs help. And he needs, again, a patsy, someone loyal to him who will do what he needs them to do without asking questions, who will just follow Baker's lead. And that's Chris Austin. So he is enlisted by Baker to assist in the murder of Fabio. And it worked. So one of the things that the law says is that when you are using the testimony of an accomplice, and in this case, Baker's an accomplice, Austin's an accomplice. When I say accomplice, I mean someone who is subject to prosecution for the same crime. And we know, obviously, Baker is an accomplice because he pled to the conspiracy, right? And he pled to the murder. Austin, he pleads to the murder because he admitted to being a direct perpetrator, a stabber, a killer, right? When you are using an accomplice, you have to have, either side, you have to have independent evidence that connects the defendant to a crime, okay? Independent evidence, which is what I've been speaking to about basically for the last half an hour or so. Makes sense again. Like I said, the law contemplates all of these things because you don't want to believe somebody who's an accomplice, who therefore may have a motive to lie or an interest in the outcome of the prosecution, without knowing the person has some independent credibility. Like I said, always the most important. What verifies what he said, right? So you're already going to start out with a strike against you. You can go up or down from there, right? Baker went down and he went down and he just kept going down. But Austin, we had to look for independent evidence. And even though the law says that the corroboration you're looking for is separate evidence than what the accomplice testified to that connects the defendant to the crime, I'm telling you, in addition to that, make sure that before you believe one of the two accomplices in this case, that you have independent evidence that verifies, like I said in the proffer agreement, that verifies, that corroborates, that proves independently that what they're telling you is true. Because you want to make sure that you're putting your faith, your trust in the right person, right? And so the law says just that you have to have independent evidence tending to connect the defendant to the crime of murder. And there is a ton of that, which I've talked about. So what you do is you go back a step. You go back to before November of last year, when finally there was sufficient evidence to go up and take Mr. Austin into custody, regardless of whether or not he gave up anything. He was coming to LA. He was going to be prosecuted. So take him out of the case. Take out his testimony. It's easy to do. He didn't come till very late in the people's case. Take him out of the case and look at what's left. What do you have? Well, independently from records, we can put, from the cell phone and cell tower records and Cyray's testimony, we can put Baker at that strip mall the same time as Fabio on January 22nd, right? We have cell tower records. We have cell tower records that show that Baker goes to LAX to pick up Austin on the morning of January 22nd. We have cell tower records that show that Baker took Austin to the area of the flyaway on the 23rd. We have now a ticket, we don't need Austin to tell us, we have a ticket putting Austin in the rental car, and we have cell tower records, cell data, showing that Baker, when the defendant calls him later in the morning on January 23rd, putting him at the location of the Enterprise rental car, where he gets his friend Paula to rent him a car, because now his cars are glitchy. We know that Baker, again, from these independent records, isn't just at the strip mall when Fabio shows up there in the evening on January 22nd, that Sunday, but also cell tower records that put Baker waiting at that location for a couple of hours before Fabio even shows up there. Again, as I talked about yesterday, coincidence, or am I hitting the button because it doesn't pass the smell test? No, it's inside information. He doesn't have a crystal ball. We have the text string between the defendant and Fabio on January 22nd regarding picking up phone near me. We have the defendant's Google search where she's looking for faux places near me. And then she specifically Googles this location off Ventura Boulevard, faux California, or faux CA. I believe CA stands for California. So the defendant is already figuring out where she's sending Fabio. And then we have more. We have then the defendant, to cover it up and make it look like this is just innocent. I'm sending my husband out on Sunday night to pick up Fa. She texts Bella, do you want fried rice? More. And again, this is not exhaustive because you can see I could be up here for probably weeks and I won't run out. Mrs. Baker, she writes that on the mirror. She signs her letters that way, before and after the murder. As I talked about, the use of these encrypted apps, and then the deletion of the encrypted apps. The destruction of evidence. Remember, we heard the defendant and Baker again in the overhears. Again, these individuals know they're being recorded. They know it. But at some point, they forget. Even as they're telling each other, we're so smart. We're smarter. We're unique. We're special, baby. No, they do the same thing all the other morons do back there. They eventually forget they're being recorded and they talk. And she says, they're going to look at your computer. My what? Your computer. Gone. What? Gone. Gone? Yeah, can you believe it? It broke the day before. No good. Got rid of it. Remember that? And then there was that whole ridiculous, now it's coming back to me, line of questions where I asked him about that, and he said, oh, his computer had been stolen out of his car. Remember that whole thing? Anyway. The testimony of Cy-Ray, that's independent. The level of communications between them. Cy-Ray told you these are extreme. I don't think you needed him to tell you that. Thousands. And what about when they get put into, as I said earlier, the back of the patrol vehicle? Again, you think deny everything? When the defendant said that to Baker, deny everything. You think she's talking about an affair? You think they think they're being put in the back of a patrol car for an affair? Because these guys, they don't got enough to do? More. What about and I'm going to get into this, what about all of her lies? Her lies to law enforcement, where they kept pounding on this same topic over and over and over again. Wasn't she calling you? Didn't she want to know about the investigation? She wanted to know, what were you doing to solve her husband's murder? No, that's not why she was calling. She wanted to know what the investigative information was so they could prepare for it. She asked specifically, what about the DNA? Over and over and over. And Detective Parshall and Detective Verna did exactly what they were supposed to do. They're not going to give up info. They're going to play that close to the vest. Well, nothing came back. It all came back to Fabio. So that puts her at ease. Because, again, they know. She knows Baker cut himself at the scene. And so they're worried whether or not his DNA is going to come back in any of these crime scene samples. And so, again, this ridiculous racquetball story. The problem is with the racquetball story, and I'm sure you've probably already put this together, there's numerous problems that we'll talk about. Matt Nurse saw them there that morning, never saw them play racquetball. Jessica, at the time this is fresh in her mind, is interviewed by law enforcement. She goes to the gym with mom, they work out, they go on the treadmill, no racquetball. The defendant is interviewed over and over and over again about the details of what she did on January 23rd, never mentions racquetball, never mentions any injury. Delia's there that day. So we know she doesn't come home dripping blood from some towel or whatever you want to believe she would have had to have bring home in order to get blood all over the house and smeared onto objects in her bedroom that are rifled through and left in the sink. Delia's cleaned that place up. None of that stuff was there. Why would Delia lie? She didn't. And there's no blood on the racket. Either racket. So that story fails. And then we hear them in the back of in the lockup talking about the racquetball story. Well, maybe it wasn't that day. Maybe it was another day, because Jessica said we didn't play that day, but we did play that day. Oh, did you tell them? Did you tell them that you cracked me in the hand with the racket? Right? And then there's no records of it at LA Fitness, as Matt says. And then Sheila gets up on the stand and says, we were there that night. We didn't see Baker that night. The first time I saw him, he had somebody take over the league. It was later on that week, and I noticed that night, I think it was Thursday, that he had an open cut on his finger. The next time I saw it, it was bandaged. He told us about the murder. We didn't even know about the murder. But he wasn't at the gym that night. Baker said, oh no, I went there to make an alibi. Remember that? And I asked him, well, how is it an alibi? It's not for the time period during the murder. It's not proof of anything. So again, it's this big messed up story that they're trying to use to explain away the DNA evidence at the crime scene. And again, as I said, you probably have already figured this out, but the one piece of evidence then that they can't explain away is then, if that's the explanation on why you think the DNA or Baker's DNA is there because of suddenly this racquetball accident on the day when you're arrested, and you volunteer this statement to Detective Gable when he tells you about Baker's DNA, how does it explain away Baker's DNA in the Porsche? Again, fatal flaw. And then there's more. As I talked about, sending Bella to pick up the glasses, the meet-up at the Target, which we spent all this time running around with, and then Baker just gets up there, admits it, and tells the defense investigator there that he went to Target to meet up with her. The use of the burner phones, and then, of course, as I mentioned, the destruction of evidence, which, as I told you, is, bless you, evidence of consciousness of guilt. And again, it goes on. Post-murder conduct, leaving the daughters alone, who in their right mind would do that? We even heard about that, bless you, from Deborah Obad. She's talking to Parshall. She's telling him how he should investigate this case because she's Nancy Drew. And so they start calling her Nancy Drew because she keeps referring to herself that way, and she thinks she's part of the investigation, and they must need her help because she's brilliant. Just ask her. And they tell her, yeah, I wouldn't leave my daughters at home in that house. And she says, yeah, me neither, right? But she's a good friend. She's not going to confront the defendant. She's a good friend because as she's doing all this, calling Parshall 50 times, and she was offended. Remember when Ms. Stagel asked her, well, did you know you were being recorded? No, I did not. Okay. But their transcripts are wrong. Well, transcripts are made from a recording. Well, the defense investigators' reports are wrong. Okay. That one I'll believe. Lack of concern for the daughters. Now, here's something I want to bring up. And it relates back to the FA pickup and all those messages and Google searches. If you're just sending your husband out on a Sunday night to pick up dinner, and I don't care if we're talking about Chinese food, if we're talking about Mexican food, if we're talking about Vietnamese pho, why do you need to delete your Google searches? She does that because she doesn't think Fabio's coming back, right? And so there's going to be an investigation. The same, what was the word? I can't remember now the word, I'll think of it, that Deborah had used. The same suspicious behavior, the same behavior that shows consciousness of guilt that she does on the 23rd. Remember on the 23rd when she goes into Ralph's? What did Cyree say that she does in the 10 minutes she's in Ralph's? She deletes Lifestyle Lounge and a bunch of other things from her phone. Right?
Council, let me interrupt you at this time. Let's take our morning recess for 15 minutes. The admonition applies. I'll see you here in 15.
So one of the things I did want to bring up, and it's going to come up again when I talk about the timeline a little bit on the 23rd, but again, independent evidence that connects the defendant to the crime of murder and the conspiracy. And here you can see on the slide, it says lies about text alert from safe. So, again, just pulling out little pieces to try to put them in context. Remember when the defendant is first interviewed on the night of the murder, January 23rd. Just across the street, right? And we know she's over there with the daughters, and she goes, they interview her alone in a room, and then they interview the daughters, and they have a conversation with her about various things. And then remember the testimony of Corey Hawk, who now works for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And at the time of the murder, Corey Hawk was working for LAPD's crime lab. And she was working in the field investigation unit, and she was called out to the crime scene to process the scene with her partner, Matt Salcedo, and Detective Verna flew in and testified about how that works, how crime scenes like a homicide scene get processed, and how it's a collaborative effort so that they understand, what they're looking for and what might be relevant and what not. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was that the crime scene was obviously staged, and I talked about the reasons that support that, and that there was blood evidence on items in the master bedroom, which is the only room that's ransacked, which also is part of that support for that proposition. But the blood evidence on those items indicates murder happens first, right? Which means it's not a burglar. Nobody's breaking into burglarize. Targeted hit. So Corey Hawk said that when she went into the master bedroom it appeared to her that the master bedroom walk-in closet was untouched. It was undisturbed. And they were told by the defendant, remember she does a walkthrough the next morning, I think it's with Detective Gutierrez, Efren Gutierrez, and Bucknell, and on their way out they're showing her, like, we processed this, and there's fingerprint powder here, and this was swabbed, and we took certain items, and so on and so forth. And Corey Hawk says that she did not swab anything on the safe because it was undisturbed. So she was going to leave that. She thought the surface material of the safe was better left for latents, right? And so latent prints, meaning prints that are not visible to the eye. You have to dust them with black powder or use some other type of processing that makes those latent prints patent or visible. And so the defendant also is interviewed January 23rd, and then remember there's a phone call, and we played you her recorded calls, and you can go back through all the transcripts and the recordings. But they keep going back to the 20th and the 21st because the crime scene doesn't make sense because it's a staged scene and the Rolex is on the wrist. And so she says, again, on May 18th, and remember this is the date that detectives Parshall and Berna bring in robbery homicide detectives Chris Gable and his partner at that time, Barry Tellis, and they are working together, but the ruse that they are using is that these are detectives that are working on a knock-knock burglar task force, remember? Because the minute you bring up, oh, these guys are from robbery homicide division, it has a different, it sits different, right? And they don't want to blow what they know is now going on because now they've accessed records and things like that, and robbery homicide is moving in to take over. And so they go through the scene with the defendant. They come to the house, May 18th, 2017. They walk through the house, and you can hear the recording is in Detective Gable's pocket, his jacket pocket. And so you can sometimes hear it's muffled, but you hear them all talking, and we played it through him, and he testified about it. And they go into the closet, and they're talking about, before they're in the closet, they're in the master bedroom, and they're talking about the slider and whether it was locked or unlocked and things of that nature, which obviously either the front door, as I said, is either unlocked or the slider door is left unlocked. Because remember, Baker says, oh, I was going to go around the back because I know it's always unlocked. And my question to him was, well, you've said to us before that you've only been there twice. The night that you were so drunk that she had to bring you home because you were puking all over the place, and you slept in her bed, which we know is a BS story because Fabio's out of town. And so Jessica tells Deborah Obad, as Obad says, blabbermouth Jessica told her Monica didn't come home till 1 or 2 in the morning that night. And Monica, the defendant, tells Jessica that Sheila and Rob both slept over because she wants to make it sound innocuous, but Sheila left earlier. And then we know, of course, Sheila's never been there until that Thursday after the murder when she comes over with Rob Baker to pay a condolence call. But they go into the master bedroom walk-in closet, and the defendant shows them the safe. And remember, I asked Baker about this because it's hidden. We're going to get to the slide that shows it, but I want to bring it up now because I see it here on my slide. There is a mirror, a long mirror that is behind the master bedroom closet, walk-in closet door. So it's hidden. Not only is it behind the door, but it's also hidden behind a mirror. And the defendant tells the detectives that every time the mirror opens, there's a sensor attached to the mirror. Whenever the mirror is opened, she gets a text to her phone, right? And she says that that alerts her that someone has opened the mirror because behind the mirror is the safe, right? And she says, but I didn't get one that day. I didn't get one on the 23rd of January. I did not get a text meaning no one opened the mirror or the safe on January 23rd, right? Well, then you heard that and saw, again, putting together pieces that might not have made sense at the time, there is a text that does come to her phone on January 23rd, and it comes at 2:03. And where is the defendant? At 2:03 on January 23rd. She's home. Who opens the safe? The defendant does. Fabio's working from home. He's not fiddling around with the safe. And what does she tell the detectives is kept in the safe? There's no reason for Fabio to be opening the safe. Fabio's gun, certainly not taking out his gun on January 23rd and playing with his gun, his gold coins, and some money, right? And then Baker gets on the stand, and Baker says, well, there were gold coins. They were sitting out on the patio. Remember that ridiculous story? And there was paperwork from the gold coins. And so I took all of that. How, again, coincidental is that he knows he needs to pay Austin, and Austin knows that, as he testified, Fabio is a collector of things such as gold coins. And lo and behold, Fabio's got the gold coins just sitting next to him out there on the patio while Fabio is working, because maybe Fabio just wants to, I don't know, sit out there and admire them or read through paperwork about gold coins. And in his rush to get out the door, because now they're in this short time frame window that I've talked about, this slim window that has to be shoehorned, manufactured, manipulated by the defendant to make it work. Austin and Baker commit the murder. They have to lie in wait for a time when they, as Baker said, when they're going to decide to rush out through the door from the kitchen onto the patio to take Fabio by surprise, lying in wait. And once they do that, they both, Austin says he turns around, like he barely has time to like open his eyes, and Baker's already in the house and gone, because again, they've got a short time frame, and Baker's off because he's got to now stage the crime. He's cut himself, he's taken the bleach out from underneath the sink, he's trying to clean up his own blood so as not to leave any DNA behind, which doesn't work, and he runs into the back bedroom to strew things, objects about to make it look like something, but he's bleeding and because of the knife wound, and he's leaving his own blood and transferring Fabio's blood because of plunging the knife into Fabio. And so he's leaving his own blood and Fabio's blood on various objects, as you heard about from the DNA expert. So at 2:03, before the defendant leaves for Target, she opens the safe, right? Oh, one more thing. Baker, after this story that he tells on the stand about the gold coins and the paperwork just happened to be sitting out on the patio with Fabio at that time, and lo and behold, oh my God, I got to pay Chris Austin. I'll just scoop those up, put them in my pocket. He tells the defense, remember he said, oh, that guy's lying, I didn't say that, or he didn't write it down right, or whatever. On a prior occasion, he said the gold coins were in the house. And he said, well, they were in the house because they were in my pocket. And so therefore I said it was in the house because they... Anyway, it just got worse and worse, and he kept doubling down, and it just got worse and worse. But anyway, 2:03, the defendant opens the safe, right? And we know those are the only things in there because that's what she tells law enforcement. So why would Fabio be opening the safe? We know why Monica is opening the safe, because she's going to, after the murder, as we heard from Detective Verna, she's going to report the $11,000 or so in cash, which can never be traced, and costume jewelry that has no value, and gold coins as the objects that were taken during the course of this burglary that somehow turned into a murder, right? Except the murder comes first, so the story doesn't work. So she goes in, she takes the gold coins out, and then what does she do? She does the same thing that we saw her do every time she did anything that pointed to her complicity in this crime. She deletes the text from the phone, right? You heard about that. So in the deletions column on her Celebrate extraction report, the safe opening does not come up when we dump her phone. So when we extract the data from her cell phone for January 23rd, it doesn't show anything that would indicate that her phone received a text from the mirror safe, right? So how do we find out about that? Well, we subpoena from AT&T these records that are called mobility records. Remember when I talked about the mobility records in this case? And lo and behold, when we get the mobility records, and when I say from AT&T, because remember, she's got her iPhone records. These are separate records. These go to AT&T, as she tells Detective Gable. It's called Digital Life, and it's some service that they signed up for so that when the mirror sensor is triggered and opened, so that you know someone's accessing the safe, the text goes to her phone. And lo and behold, the mobility records show that at 2:03 on January 23rd, a text went to her phone. So she then deletes it, right? Because she's got to cover up why she'd be going into the safe earlier on the day when her husband just happens to get murdered. All right. Then on top of all the other evidence, as I mentioned, we heard numerous statements by Baker, where he says in the recorded jailhouse courthouse lockup, that he's going to take the blame, he's going to take the fall for the defendant. So when I talk about accomplice corroboration, just going back for a couple so you can see, I mean, I've got numerous slides of it. I'm sure you can come up with additional items. So you can kick that around back there. But that's one of the requirements under the law, is that there has to be independent evidence that tends to connect the defendant to the commission of the crime. So now I want to talk a little bit more about Christopher Austin. As you heard, he's got no prior record. He pled guilty in this case based on what he admitted to the second-degree murder, along with the use of a knife. I talked yesterday about the fact that his plea negotiations are dependent on his truthful and complete testimony at trial. Who makes that call? Not me. And that he provided information about January 22nd, the first attempted hit on Fabio that we never, ever heard about from Baker. And he's interviewed numerous times. It's not until they go in there and they say to Baker, hey, they now have Austin. And he's telling them that you guys went out to this strip mall and tried to kill Fabio the night before he was killed. Oh. And by the way, they have forensic evidence that puts you there. So now what does he do? He tries to construct a story around the evidence, which is what I accused him of doing numerous times on the stand. So you know how that went down. And so when you think about Christopher Austin, and I expect you'll spend some time back there talking about various witnesses, including Christopher Austin, and you should, because he is an accomplice, and you need to make sure that you believe his testimony. Same thing you have to do with Baker. And you might think a lot of things about Christopher Austin, and you might also be divided on what y'all think. I mean, maybe you think he's a horrible person, who should obviously have refused to help Baker commit a murder. Maybe you think he's just as guilty as Baker, and so therefore he deserves the same sentence, that he should spend the rest of his life in prison, life without parole, like Baker. Maybe you think we gave him too light of a deal. Maybe you think the indeterminate sentence of 16 to life, meaning he might not get out for decades because it's indeterminate, was too heavy. Maybe you think we were too harsh. Maybe you feel bad for him. Maybe you think he did what he did out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to Baker. Maybe you think he's an idiot. Maybe you think he came across as contrite. and that he's likely going to live with the guilt of what he did for the rest of his life. And those are all things that are interesting to ponder and food for probably ample conversation back there. But whether you like him or not is irrelevant. The question is, do you believe him? Does what he said, what he testified to, what he stated in his proffer over 2 different dates make sense? Is it consistent? Is it supported by other evidence? And I just spent some time today talking about accomplice corroboration. Does his demeanor tell you that it's likely he's telling the truth? Or maybe you came away thinking he's a habitual liar just like Baker, not to be trusted. It's fine. You can come to the same conclusion on this case that we had before we had Austin, looking at all the evidence that I just talked about with you, all the independent evidence when you take Austin out of the case and look at what's left. But what we did learn about from Austin is this small window of time that he learned from Baker. And we know that the defendant and Baker had to come up with an alternate plan after January 22nd didn't go down as they had planned. And so they are now looking to try and find another window, as Baker said, another window of opportunity where they're ready to go on a moment's notice when he gets information from the defendant. And so we know that Monday might not have been an ideal time because we heard that Fabio was supposed to have some sort of a colonoscopy appointment that day. That's why he was working from home. We also heard that Delia, Miss Rivera, is there that day cleaning, so we've got to wait for her to clean. The defendant has to get Jessica out of the house to the Obad's home to babysit. And we know that Baker and Austin are going to have to complete the murder and get out of there before Isabella returns from school. And so they also have the opportunity to delay her a little longer by sending her to pick up the eyeglasses from the eye doctor. We also know, obviously, from looking at the job that Baker did, that he had to rush, just as he said, the staging of the crime scene. Because we heard about, and we'll talk about the defendant sending that last message to him via Viber at 4:46, right? And so how else would Baker know when that specific window would be? Because I just went through a litany of various individuals that you're going to have to work around in order to make that opportune time fit. You're talking about a time period of a little less or a little more maybe than a half an hour. We know they're turning from Oakdale onto Queen Victoria at 4:18, and they still have to get up to the house. They still got to figure out which door they're going to go in, which obviously Baker has to know about ahead of time. As Austin said, they knew what that the defendant was leaving the door open for them. And then they also have to sneak through the house to be careful about where Fabio might be, because he might, bless you, not still be out on the back patio. And so, again, all of this requires an incredible amount of timing and manipulation of the time period. And then you also have to think not just about how Baker and Austin, because Baker has to go back, pick up Austin, they've got to get the rental car, Austin in the rental car, they've got to drive over to the location, which is, you heard from the detectives from the SIS surveillance crew, is a few miles away, and they have to park that car and then jog up from there to the house. And so in order to determine that precise time period, you have to believe that they also knew, going through all of these efforts, that Fabio, let's say, is not out like he was earlier that morning, still trying to get the power washer fixed. We saw him driving out earlier in the morning, and then he texts the defendant while she's at LA Fitness saying that he's back. And she asked if he got it fixed. We know he went out the day before also with Ernie to try and get it fixed. Whether he's going out for lunch, whether he's going to stop at the office, whether he has other errands to run. And so the only one who knows what everybody's schedule is that day, the family and Miss Rivera, is the defendant. That information, that specific time window, time frame, specific, precise, short period during that day where Baker knows he has to be ready to go, has to be provided by the defendant. And as I mentioned, Austin said that Baker told him she left him alone. We have to go now. She's going to the store. And that's exactly what she does in order to make an alibi. And so remember also in the proffer statement, the 2-day proffer the defense played for you, that Austin also specified that Baker told him the victim should be on the patio as they jogged up to the home that day, which of course he was. Where do you think that information came from? And so again, as I mentioned, we should look, bless you, at the evidence that corroborates Christopher Austin, as I've gone through today, in various areas of his testimony to show that what he says is credible, that you can rely, bless you, on his testimony that he gave. And so, again, we have all of this evidence with respect to not just the 23rd, but also the 22nd, where the same thing happens. And we know that there are messages based on the testimony of Cyree going back and forth between starting out with the defendant and Fabio with respect to, she tells him obviously she wants pho. He starts looking at pho near me. He instant messages her. She looks it up. She sends him an address. They go, Baker and Austin, out to that strip mall, and they wait there for Fabio, knowing he's going to come. And then Cyree tells us, even though Baker says, oh no, I left my phone home that day because I didn't want to be tracked. We know that's BS, because Cyree says, oh no, he and Monica, he and the defendant, are messaging 69 times during that time period while Baker is waiting in the parking lot for Fabio to show up. So almost 70 times they're going back and forth while Monica is updating him as to the status. And how do we know? How does anybody know that maybe Fabio is going to say, you know what, I don't feel like Vietnamese tonight. I don't want pho. I'm a Mexican. Right? So she has to get him to go where she wants him to go, where she's been communicating with Baker for 2.5 hours as they're sitting there in this parking lot, waiting for Fabio to show up. And remember what Austin says? While we're there, he says, oh, he should be here now. So he's getting real-time communications from the defendant as to where Fabio is. And that's when Austin gets out of the car from the back lot at this strip mall, walks down a couple of steps, or up a couple of steps through this alleyway that we saw, through the pillars, and finds this location looking for the vehicle Baker described, which Baker didn't even get right in his testimony. Remember, he's like, it's the Porsche, and I led him down this path with the Porsche, and how he had the GPS on the Porsche, and he knew it was the Porsche, and he described the Porsche to Austin. And then I said, well, how did you describe the Porsche? Well, it's a black Porsche. Well, what if I told you he wasn't driving the Porsche that night? He was driving the Ford F-150. Well, that can't be right. And Austin tells us he's driving the Ford F-150. He told me it was a dark color, blue or black Ford F-150. Show me a picture of the guy. Said he was a big guy. So again, you have all of that evidence. So now let's talk about Baker. We talked about the fact that he's a convicted sex offender. He tried to lie to you about the charges that he pled to in that case. We know that he tried to lie to you and claim he didn't know what he was convicted of in this case. We know that he came up with more than a dozen stories. There's probably more than several dozen stories in his ridiculous letter alone that I went painstakingly through with him line by line to bring out all the relevant facts to show you how ridiculous that initial story was, that he took all this time, a day, to write out for the defense attorneys, claiming he wanted them to give it to Monica because this was his apology letter about how he said Fabio attacked him in the house and he didn't see it coming and knocked him out, but then he went into this unconscious rage and killed Fabio. But then Fabio would be dead in the house, and it was a ridiculous story. So obviously, he had to go back and come up with other versions. So we heard about that, but no matter how many versions he told, he still never got to the truth. And of course, the other problem we have is instead of getting a court order to bring in a laptop to show him things, they didn't get a court order. Maybe they just didn't want to get a court order to show him, not just to show him things on the laptop, but to record them. You can get a court order to record them so that we would have that, like LAPD provided. So you would know exactly what was said, and we could play those in court for him, and you would have a record, a real-time record of what exactly he said, and you didn't have to worry about what some investigator wrote in his notes and then didn't write in his report and then destroyed his notes, or put in his report and didn't put in his notes, and back and forth 100 times. There's a very simple way of ensuring that the evidence is what you say it is and being able to prove it. You record it. So again, we know he's a compulsive liar. We know that he devised this elaborate story one after another to try and sell you, thinking that you would buy it. And, I pushed the button maybe a few too many times during his testimony, but here we are. We also know that the defendant and Baker devised an elaborate scheme, just as they did on the outside prior to the murder and after the murder, before they were taken into custody. They did the same type of planning and scheming to be able to secretly communicate once they were apprehended. You heard about that in detail, excruciating detail, from Detective Mitzi Roberts. They used other inmates' PIN numbers, just like they used encrypted apps, so they could communicate secretly by sending jail letters to each other through other inmates' names, by using other inmates' PIN numbers to make what they referred to as clean calls, so the calls wouldn't be traced back to them. They called through third parties. They figured out times by sending letters to one another that they would either destroy, as we heard them talking about, or that they would hide in other inmates' bunks. And you heard about, in one recording, the defendant claiming that the other inmates in her cell area, the room that she was housed in, they were all angry at her because everybody's bunks kept being tossed because she was hiding jail letters from Baker in other people's places to prevent them from being found and traced back to her. You also heard about the fact that Robert Baker has been sentenced to life without parole. That means that, as I talked to him on the stand, we can't punish him or do anything to him if he lies. He's already got the maximum sentence, right? So no repercussions. It's a freebie. He can get up here, treat this courtroom like his own sandbox, and treat it with the contempt and the disrespect that he did, and lie minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, and it just never ended. And so, it's very difficult when you lie, when you're a habitual, compulsive liar. It's very difficult to keep track of your lies because they're not based on anything when you look back and try to remember. If you have an event in your head and you tell somebody about that event, every time it comes up, there might be additional things that you recall, there might be details you might forget over time, but the event is the event. When you're making up things out of whole cloth from the beginning, there is nothing to look back on in your memory to draw from. And so the story just keeps changing. So again, these are various things, as I talked about earlier, that the judge is going to instruct you on some of the factors you can take into account in determining the credibility of a witness. Remember how he said over and over, well, I can't remember. This was 8 years ago. This was so long ago. How am I supposed to remember? And compare that to Christopher Austin, where, you know, I'm going to tell you this is what I can remember, but then this other part here with the Vegas, I remember going to the Aria. I remember going to her house. I remember meeting her at LA Fitness, but I can't tell you that I met her at that point in time. So again, the refusal to answer certain questions. What's his motive to lie? Well, that was recorded for you. For forever, 10 years from now, it'll still be recorded for you. He wants to get her out, and we heard about some of the motivation, such as her being able to support him from the outside, especially once she gets the money. We heard their talk about some of these sex acts the two of them would perform for one another in the lockup. And he talked about, well, that's just jailing, I think he said. That's just how you do jail. You know, you both show your private parts, you ejaculate. You heard them on one of the recorded calls where she says, oh my God, baby, how did you do that? And he's like, well, it took some time. And she's like, oh, I need paint. Give me some paint. They're talking about how he got his semen into this trial-size toothpaste tube that he then passes to her. And I don't know what she was planning on doing with it, and I'm not going to go there. I'm sure you can sit around and dream up all sorts of things. But again, we're talking about two extremely narcissistic, depraved individuals who have convinced themselves that the big bad government, the big bad system, those dirty, lying police officers and prosecutor are just making up evidence because they did nothing other than have an affair and fell in love. And so you hear them saying that nice and loudly for the recording devices over and over and over. And I think y'all know by now, we all got better things to do. So, again, various things that you can take into account in determining witness credibility. But again, you know, comparison, right? Christopher Austin, Robert Baker. You don't have to use either one of them. I'm totally fine. You want to throw out Austin? You feel like he didn't give you anything? Throw him out. I don't care. You got plenty of other evidence in this case. However, when you do like a comparative analysis between the two of them, I mean, you're talking night and day, right? And it was made even more apparent when you had Austin on the stand day after day undergoing cross-examination. You didn't see that guy blowing his top. I mean, I might have blown my top at some point because my patience level over the years has definitely decreased. I get yelled at, but that's okay. But he didn't. He didn't blow his top, Mr. Austin, when he was asked the same story over and over and over again. He didn't say, I'm getting out of here, I'm done answering these questions. He didn't have to be told by the judge to sit down. He didn't have to have you removed from the courtroom while the judge had a little talk with the witness in private so he could explain the facts of life and have what I sometimes call a come to Jesus moment. That didn't happen with Mr. Austin, right? So, you know, you can do that. You can do that little comparative analysis. You had Austin on the stand, then, you know, a little while later you had Baker on the stand, and then, lo and behold, you get the gift of getting Austin back on the stand again, and then that comparative analysis became even more clear after listening to Mr. Baker for a few days. But there's another instruction the judge is going to give you, and the instruction talks to you or instructs you what you can do if you find that a witness is willfully false. In other words, if you find that you have a witness who lies under oath or is willfully false, as Mr. Baker admitted over and over in his testimony or denied, depending on what part it was, the law says that if you find that there is a witness who is materially false, now I'm not talking about when he lies about something that's not material. I'm talking about, the meat and potatoes. When you have somebody who is willfully false about a material aspect of the evidence in the case, that witness should be distrusted, right? Which makes, again, sense under the law. Common sense. You have a witness who is lying to you over and over and over. I mean, at some point, you might be able to find some little kernels in there that you can rely on because they're corroborated independently by other evidence. But what the law says is that if you find that there's a witness who is willfully false in a material part of their testimony, they should be distrusted in other parts of their testimony. And then the law goes further. And the law says that if you find that to be the case with somebody like Robert Baker, that you can then reject the entire testimony of that witness. You can take your little notepads and you can just cross that stuff right on out and move on to the next piece of evidence. So when I hear that instruction that's given in every case, I think of a piece of moldy bread. So when you have a piece of moldy bread, you're not going to cut around the mold and use the rest of it. You're going to take that piece of bread and you're going to throw it away, right? That is at your discretion. That is your choice. You're the jurors who are, as I said earlier, the judges of what the facts are. Oh, one more thing, and I'm sure this didn't escape you, but also recall one of the tactics Mr. Baker thought was useful was to claim and make a distinction between when he spoke to the defense investigators and, as Mr. Levine said, asked him or told him over and over, we're not going to call you unless you tell the truth, and then he would lie. And then they'd come back and they'd say, we're not going to call you unless you tell the truth, and then he'd lie. And then they'd come back and they'd do the same song and dance, right, 12 times. And so after 12 of those, he still manages to get onto the stand because, well, we told you so, sir, right? And then he does this, makes this distinction, and he says to you, well, I took some law classes, and it's okay if I lie because those were unofficial statements. But now this is an official statement. Okay, you're not going to see anything, I can promise you, you're not going to see anything in any of the law that the judge is going to give you that's going to make a distinction between official and unofficial statements. In fact, I'll go even further. Official and unofficial, those terms do not appear in the law, okay? There's truth and there's a lie. And you remember where it became so ridiculous that I held up my pen and I said, I'm holding up my pen here. Can you see this? If I were to tell you this pen is blue, is that the truth or a lie, right? Just trying to bring it down to like maybe terms he can understand. All right. We already talked, I think, about Matt Nurse, so I'm going to, you heard from Elise, we talked about the racquetball people. I'm going to go past that. We heard that the defendant and Baker went on numerous double dates. You can see them here with Sheila Salehian and Ricardo Cabrera. You remember Sheila testified about the fact that the defendant and Robert Baker, prior to the murder, were very affectionate with one another. They held hands a lot. They were always touching one another. They were hugging. They were kissing. And that although Sheila and Ricardo knew the defendant was married, this was a very interesting piece of information. The defendant never mentioned Fabio. Never mentioned him. Even after the murder. Never mentioned him. And remember when Sheila says she goes over with Baker when they first saw him at the gym that week after the murder, which would have been Thursday the 26th. they follow Baker and Matt Nurse over to the Sementilli home, and when Sheila is about ready to leave for the evening with Ricardo, she gives the defendant a hug, and what does the defendant say to her when she is in the middle of this grieving period 3 days after her husband's murder? Take care of Rob for me. Okay. The other thing Sheila tells us is that neither the defendant nor Baker ever mentioned her daughters. They just weren't part of the equation. Okay? I'm going to skip through this. You've seen this. These are photos that were taken in Robert Baker's underground parking garage, and you'll have these photographs available to you as well. All right, let's talk about the DVR a little bit. If you remember at the beginning, towards the beginning of the case, we heard from Mr. Khan. Sean Abdul Khan is the owner of First Digital, that on June 28th of 2016, he went out to the home to install a new home surveillance system and some new cameras. We heard Fabio was not there that day, and at some point, we know the defendant took over the communications with Mr. Khan via email and approved the contract for the upgraded system. This is Exhibits 128, as well as 135 and 136. And one of the things the defendant specifically wanted was the ability to access the camera system remotely from her iPhone. And so that is why Khan spent time showing her how to use remote access and how the IDMSS-like app worked as he testified. And so he goes over to the home on June 28th. He installs with his installer 4 new cameras, as well as a new monitor in the kitchen and a new DVR box. And remember, he's talking about this is those slimline, because this is now 2017, it's not those big bookish DVRs, it's a slimline box, and he installs that in the cabinet in the garage above the cabinet. And so there's 5 cameras in total. He doesn't replace, there's a camera, an old camera at the intercom near the gate. And he hooks that camera up as the 5th camera to the system and the DVR box as well, so that they can see it on the monitor. Those are Exhibits 129 through 134. And this gives you the idea of the angle of each of those cameras that the defendant would be able to view from her remote access as she was at Target a little bit later that day, on the day of the murder. This is June 28th. Again, when we talk about the that new DVR box, it's, as Detective Gable and Detective Vernon noted, it was not something that would be easily visible above that cabinet in the garage. We know Baker's relatively short at 5'7", but both Verna and Gable, when they were asked, well, what evidence did you have? Why did you think the defendant was involved? They both talked about the fact that that DVR box was in an area out of the line of sight. So if a visitor were to come to the home, it wasn't something you would automatically see. Someone would have had to tell you about it. And of course, as I talked about yesterday, even Ms. Rivera didn't know where it was. And then if you recall, I had this long, it's not I can see, this long string of questions with Mr. Baker on the stand, where he wanted you to believe so badly that he just followed the wires from the kitchen to the box. And then we showed him the photographs of the monitor in the kitchen, and there's no wires, right? And he's like, oh no, I didn't mean in the kitchen, I meant in the garage. Well, where in the garage? Well, coming through the wall. Okay, well, what if it's not coming through the wall? Well, then it was coming through the ceiling, but there were wires. I followed the wires. Okay, so there's no wires in the kitchen. The wires up above you wouldn't be able to see behind the box. There were no wires there either, coming from the wall, coming from the ceiling, coming from any place that was visible. This was a professional install company. All the wires are hidden. And then the other point I want to make about that DVR box was that obviously the DVR was taken because the defendant had to have told Baker that it's not a cloud-based system. So in other words, it's okay. Wasn't a cloud-based system, so that meant once you take the box, you take any recording, right? Because otherwise, if it was a cloud-based system, taking the box doesn't get you anywhere, right? Because it's already been uploaded, it uploads to the cloud, there would be no purpose. And so how would he know that? How would he know that it's not a cloud-based system so that he would actually take the time as he's running around the house, you know, trying to stage the scene, clean up his own blood, goes into the garage, and then he makes this attempt to turn off the power so he can yank the DVR box, and then has to pull the manual release to drive the Porsche out. Why would he have the time to do all that if he didn't know that the DVR wasn't cloud-based? And that, again, would be based on inside information that had to have come from the defendant. Here you can see the kitchen. One thing, and on the left you can see the wires are left loose up there for where the DVR box. Remember when this was shown to various people? Well, there's the DVR box, and Detective Gable kept saying, no, sir, the DVR box isn't there. That's a crime scene photo. These are both crime scene photos. DVR box is gone. It was taken on January 23rd. So the only thing that you're seeing up there is wires. There is no DVR box, okay? And you can see on the right, the monitor, there's no wires, okay? Now, one thing I do want to bring up while we're on this slide, because I don't know that we're going to show it again, but remember placard number 12, and remember the purpose from Corey Hawk with respect to the placards? The placards are to identify stains, right? Areas where she collected red stains that tested positive. We talked about presumptive tests that they can use for blood. And there's a stain on the drawer there that dripped down that was placed there by Robert Baker. And what we heard was that Fabio, even though Baker said, oh no, the keys were on the counter, obviously the reason Baker's blood is on, or Fabio, I don't remember if it's Fabio now, or Baker's blood is on that drawer there near the monitor is because that's the drawer where Fabio kept his keys, which again, how does Baker know in his haste to stage the crime scene now, remove the DVR box and also get the car keys? He'd have no other reason why he would open that drawer but for the fact that, again, he had inside information. And then, of course, Miss Obed tries to change her testimony and say, oh, no, I don't remember it being that drawer. I think it was further this way. The monitor has been moved. Okay, again, just like we said with Baker, these are crime scene photos. This is the location of where the monitor was at the time of the crime. Everything is photographed in place so that, again, 8 years later, we have a record of where these objects were. Come up with a better story next time. All right. And then we also know that the defendant sends a message to Khan after he leaves on June 28th saying she can't connect through her phone to the system. And then Khan shoots off an email to his tech support saying, can you help Miss Sementilli, please? And then a couple minutes later, she sends back, I got it, with exclamation point, thanks, meaning she can live stream her surveillance feed from anywhere, as he testified. And he also testified, if you recall, that data spikes from her internet service provider records would indicate that she accessed and live streamed her home surveillance video cameras, which would show you traffic on her home IP bandwidth. We brought in those records, we put those together, and all of that was testified to by Curtis Davis regarding the defendant checking her home surveillance cameras on the day of the murder. Again, a coincidence? At approximately 4 p.m. Not a coincidence. We also learned that Fabio didn't have that app on his cell phone, which was item number 67. And we also heard from the daughters that they knew their mother did. Yet, what does the defendant do? She tells law enforcement when they ask her, again, this is the woman who so desperately wants to find the killers. who did this to her husband. She desperately wants to figure out who did this crime, right? That's why she's calling law enforcement day after day after day. It's not to pump them for information, silly people. But what does she tell them? She lies. She says, oh, I never was able to do that. We got this new system. I was never able to connect to the home surveillance system through my iPhone. So again, come up with some, again, innocent explanation that is reasonable. Come up with one. I'd love to hear it when you're all done. Come up with one innocent explanation why the defendant lies to law enforcement about the fact that she's able to access her home security surveillance cameras from her iPhone. We know she's done it because we also subpoenaed, there's a lot of records in this case, we also subpoenaed the records that show that she connected to her home surveillance system on several other dates, not many. I think there's about maybe half a dozen, and the last time prior to, coincidentally, the day of the murder is November 10th of the year before. So also give me a good explanation or an innocent explanation that has to also, as I told you, be reasonable under the law as to why she chose to check the cameras that day at approximately 4 o'clock, right after she tells Jessica that she shouldn't be late to babysit. So again, I'll tell you the non-innocent, reasonable explanation, and that I assume you already know is because, again, she's trying to distance herself from the system as a whole because she utilized it to provide information to Baker on when the coast was clear for him to come and commit the murder after Jessica left. And you can look at exhibits 136 through 139 for that. Now, the same day that the defendant received the email from Khan, and 2 minutes after getting access on her phone that I just showed you, I got it, thanks. 2 minutes later, she logs on and onto her computer, and she forwards the logon instructions, as you heard, her password, her user ID, the Sementilli Wi-Fi address. She emails all of that to Robert Baker. Again, come up with an innocent yet reasonable explanation for why she would do that. And then, also, you're going to have to explain this one away too. Then she does something, again, that I told you she does over and over. What does she do? She deletes the email to Baker. Because again, by deleting the information, she can claim, I never did such a thing, right? And so she deletes the email from her sent email box, her Hotmail box. Of course, then I subpoena the Hotmail records, and we get records that you heard Officer Curtis Davis went through, and he recovers the deleted email. And you heard that out of the thousands of files in her email system, the only item she deleted from her Hotmail account was this email that she sent to Baker and Fabio's itineraries for business trips. Okay? 4 of them in total out of thousands. Coincidence? Or do I hit the button? Okay, no takers. And then, of course, we get Baker on the stand, and he acknowledges that...
I'm going to object to no takers. It implies
That was improper.
jury can respond.
That was improper.
And then, I was being sarcastic, and then Baker acknowledged that he had access to her security cameras from his phone and computers, meaning that he, in fact, was able to download the application from the App Store. There's, as you heard, IDMSS Lite is the app that for your Apple phone. There's also an Android version that Officer Davis talked about. And Baker's explanation, his innocent explanation is, well, that was just so that, we could wave to each other from the cameras, right? So, given the overwhelming evidence of a murder conspiracy in this case between the defendant and Robert Baker and Mr. Austin, again, There is no reasonable explanation for why she sends this to Baker. And remember, this is June 28th of 2016. And then deletes it from her phone. Again, more information, more evidence showing you that she's an active participant in the plan to kill her husband. And here's that information which you can see in various exhibits. Now, you also heard that on that same date of the install, June 28th of 2016, Baker's Samsung S4 connects to the Sementilli's Wi-Fi, which means he's either at the location or near the location so that he connects and he inputs the Sementilli Wi-Fi, probably because he's there to ensure that the information she just sent him works, and he's able to connect after that to the Sementilli home Wi-Fi. Now, we know later on that same night as the install, June 28th of 2016, Sam Pulera's in town, and he was in town on business, and he went to the Sementilli home that night to see the defendant and to see Fabio. And Fabio had just come home from an OPI event that day to find the new security system, the new DVR in place, and this is Exhibit 198. And you heard that Fabio was joking around with Sam, and he says to Sam, "I came home to this." We also know that Fabio that day was at an event in, I believe it was Los Angeles, because he posts on his Instagram account photographs of, men aren't going to know what this is, women do. This is OPI nail polish. OPI is a brand that's owned by Wella, and he writes, "My wife and daughters don't know it yet, but Big Daddy is bringing home a few treats from OPI." And it's on his Instagram account, FabStyle67. And so he's photographing while he's at this event that he's bringing home gifts for his wife and his girls. And the defendant is there, and she says to Sam, "Well, you know, Sam, this isn't Woodbridge. You can never be too safe," right? The following month in July, we know the defendant discussed with Baker that she was going to be in Las Vegas with Fabio, as we already talked about, for the Wella Trendsetters event at the Aria. And we know this is one of the 4 deleted items in her Hotmail account, along with the log-on instructions from First Digital. The other 3, as I told you, were itineraries relating to Fabio's business trips, and one of them is this itinerary that also has, somebody's taken a pen and drawn in a map on the map with an arrow on where to meet. And so she sends this to Baker, and so she and Baker obviously are planning their meetup at the Aria while Fab is working. This is Exhibit 216. We know, as I talked about already, that Baker makes plans with Austin to fly in from Alaska, sends him money to do so. We know that Baker picks up Austin at LAX. This is information regarding the airfare. And then we know that Baker meets up with the defendant, and he says actually on 2 different dates during this trip, while they're all in Las Vegas together at the same time at the Aria, where he claims Christopher Austin was in a different part of the hotel. And then we also heard Cy Ray testify that based on his review of all the cellular data, Baker and Austin were together at the Aria, along with the defendant, which he said was an extremely unique pattern to see all 3 of them together at the same location from reviewing all of their call detail records. Also, what Cy Ray tells us that we did not know, and I asked Baker about it, and he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about. Cy tells us, just as was the case on January 22nd of 2017, before Baker and Austin leave Baker's apartment to drive to the strip mall, Monica calls Baker. Here, just prior to their meetup at the Aria, again, the defendant calls Baker at 10:59 a.m., again, to tell him, obviously, where she's waiting. And we know Fabio's down the strip at another hotel that day. And we also have Baker's bank records confirming that he had card purchases at the Aria on a couple different days, as well as various charges while he's there in Las Vegas during the same time period. And if all that wasn't enough, we also have photographic evidence knowing that the defendant's there. She's there with her stepsister, Morella. They were very close until the defendant's arrest in this case. And we have Sal Macheri on the stage speaking at the event on the left. And you heard from various individuals such as Sal Macheri, Morella, Melanie Garibay, all talking about how Fabio and all of them were very busy working during the day, and so Monica would have had plenty of free time. And then, of course, we know that on July 26th, the defendant returns to Los Angeles, per se Ray, before Fabio does, and Austin testified, and the records show that Baker and Austin go over to the defendant's home that night. The defendant shows him the patio, where Fabio spent a lot of time, and we know he watches television there, and he falls asleep while Monica and Baker go into the master bedroom. We also know that, as I talked about earlier, November 3rd of 2016, Baker messages Michael Spence, and notice here, again, in the messages where, as Sheila said, the girls never came up, he's basically saying that the daughters are going off to school, so they, meaning he and the defendant, will be free and clear of them. Again, they're not part of the future equation that Monica and Baker are building. The photograph that I've talked about several times from November of 2016, where she's writing Mrs. Baker on the mirror, which is evidence of her future intent. We've already talked about the text messages between Ron Ray and Baker, and we've also talked about Cy Ray and his testimony regarding the volume of communications between the defendant and Baker. And Cy Ray's charts of the communications, that's Exhibit 255. Again, looking at this particular exhibit, we know that while Baker wants you to believe that they both coincidentally decided to together stop using the Viber app on January 23rd because it became glitchy, they managed to send approximately 280 messages via Viber between the two dates of January 22nd, where they attempted to kill Fabio, and January 23rd, when they were finally successful. A couple of weeks prior to Fabio's murder, we heard about the spike in communications when the defendant and Baker start to nail down the date of when this murder is going to happen, and that the defendant wants it done. And there's the communications back and forth between them and between Baker and Austin, and also at some point Al Birdsong is on the records, and this is the communications timeline from January 11th to the January 13th of 2017, and between that time period there's 445 communications on Viber, including texts and calls, and this is Exhibit 243. Here, Exhibit 261, this corroborates Austin's testimony. As I was talking about, the defendant wanted Fabio dead before he left for a business trip the end of January, which again, information had to come from the defendant, and you need to ask yourself again, what's the innocent explanation on why the defendant needs to send itineraries for Fabio's schedule to Baker, along with the password and DVR instructions. We know that on January 12th and 13th, Austin purchases his airline tickets to fly to LA, subsequent to their conversations about nailing down the dates. And we know that something very important came up while Austin was still up in Vancouver, Washington, long before any type of negotiations were made with his lawyer, or there was any serious conversation and documentation with respect to anything. While he's still up, the day he's arrested in Vancouver, Washington, he tells his cellmate, he's the first one in this case, Baker's never said it until he said at some point later to the defense investigators he knew that Monica was trying to get the insurance money. But this time, Austin, for the first time again, just like he mentioned January 22nd of 2017, which we never knew about, he tells the undercover officer in his cell on October 2nd that before he flew into Los Angeles for the purpose of killing Fabio, that the entire purpose of the murder was so that Baker's girlfriend could collect on the victim's life insurance policy. And that...
I didn't need to interrupt you.
Sorry, can I finish that one sentence?
Please.
And that he goes on to confirm that later in his proffer in November when he's brought down to Los Angeles in 2024. Thank you, Your Honor.
Let's take our recess until 1:30. As always, the admonition applies. Have a good lunch.